So for us, when we are looking at coaching and our current, any coaching process, really we are looking at how we take somebody from, their current state to a desired state. And that gap from the current state to the desired state is really what the coaching process attempts to do. And to a large extent, we sort of call this as a linear journey. And there is a shift which we are enabling, during this entire process. However, if you look at today's environment, it's something which we call as, a VUCA world. The VUCA world is the environment, look at a person just on their own, but there is a lot of interconnections with different people. There are systems involved, and it's a very complex setup in which any individual is operating. And when we are looking at helping them or partnering with them in improving their own effectiveness, so while they have leadership skills, but in a VUCA world, just those leadership skills are not sufficient. And there is a need to help develop what we call as an inner core. And this inner core is, a definition which is given at the bottom, which is really about what is the self-image at the center of it. Surrounding it is the values and beliefs. And around that is really the thoughts, feelings, behavior, which is really the mind, heart, and hand. And when we talk of self-image, it's really about how I perceive myself, how others perceive me, and how I think others perceive me. And if a self-image is something which I have great confidence on, then probably that entire image of what I perceive then becomes so strong that it allows me to move forward. Now, in a VUCA world, there are two fundamental questions which come up. One is, how am I, or where or how am I experiencing a world which sort of is dying? And it's a painful process because we don't let go. However, there is also something which is emerging. So the question is, how or where do we experience a world which sort of is getting born? And an analogy which I can draw to this is, if a seed is sown, I can't see anything coming out. But there is something which will come out. A plant will be born, a tree will come out later. So the thing is, how do I allow, or how do I recognize something which wants to come out? And at the same time, how do I let go of something which I know is dying? And in today's environment, which is the VUCA environment, this is happening all the time. There are things which are dying, and there are things which need to be born, want to be born. And as leaders, how are people dealing with it? And as coaches, how are we facilitating this? Ujjaval, can you go to the next one? And when we want any change to happen, there is a learning process involved. And so far, one of the methods of learning is, reflecting on the experiences of the past, which works well when you have a lot of stability and you can project the past onto the future. But when I'm in a VUCA world, the past, unfortunately, does not really project itself very well onto the future. So the question is, how can we learn from the future as it is emerging? And this again goes back to, how do I let go of past experiences, and how do I embrace new experiences, or how do I learn something which is going to come? Now, when we want to go through this journey, then this kind of a journey is not linear. And that's where the change sort of follows what we call as a U-shaped journey. And what we are going to talk of for the rest of this session is really about theory U, which sort of articulates this entire journey, the change of how we could move from what we can call as unconscious incompetence to a state of unconscious competence, which I think is something which we have learned a lot during the course of our coaching journeys. But that's really where we are heading to. And with this context, I would like to hand over to Ujjaval, who will take us into a little bit more of what theory U is all about. Ujjaval?
You're muted, Ujjaval.
Yeah, thanks, Ram. So when I'm taking you to Theory U, I would like to take you through the website of Presencing Institute. And as you can see that this is a beautiful website put up by Presencing Institute at MIT by Otto Scharmer. And they are talking about that how do we bring consciousness in, so in coaching context, how do we enable a shift in the consciousness of a client and help them to lead from the future as it emerges and be partner in the learning journey. So I hope you're able to see it on the screen. I'm just scrolling through. It talks about that it is one process of theory U-shaped process, but there are 5 movements. As you can see on the left side, it is saying that how do we co-initiate the journey with a client. Now I'm talking in the reference of coach-client relationship. And how do we help them to co-sense what is emerging within the client and emerging within us? And then how do you take them through a journey? How do you enable a partnership where a client comes to a moment, as we call coaching, that is the moment of presencing, where the client is also absolutely the present and something emerges within himself or herself, and that's where the new insight emerges, and then we co-create the actions and facilitate the learning. So there are 7 Theory U leadership capacities, and also I wish to tell you at this time that they are running a wonderful online course. It is there on edx.org, and that is about lab. So generally this courses starts anywhere between June to October, and then runs, it's generally a 90-day course, and which is that information is also available on the website of Presencing. So there are 7 leadership capacities, as you can see, holding the space for listening, and that's where we are going to focus on today, because they are saying that this is a 20 years old research. They have put up 2 decades of research in this, and they are saying that effectiveness is one of the biggest foundational capacities that we need to work on. And then from observing to sensing to presencing and up to crystallizing, prototyping, and co-evolving. So I'm rushing a bit for all 7 capacities, but here we would like to focus on today on how, as coaches, we are holding the space of listening. And there are 4 stages of listening that Otto Scharmer is talking about. And I would be inviting you to go through a short video clip where he defines these 4 levels of listening, and then we take it forward from there. Okay, so thank you for watching. I would invite my friend John to talk about, he would take you through some reflections of great Carl Rogers, and also how as coaches, we look at the emerging future possibility in the client. And 2 competencies, coaching presence and active listening, really helps us to connect client with their best future self. John, over to you.
Ujjaval and Bhaskar, thank you. Uh, so we have just seen the video. What I'm going to do before I actually invite some of your thoughts from the audience, I'm going to invite Bhaskar, because Bhaskar shared an interesting coaching conversation that he saw of a coach use theory U to be able to create a shift in a client. So, Bhaskar, would you be kind enough to share that story that you heard and for the benefit of all of us?
Yeah, yeah. So I was watching, like I said, Aldo Civico's webinar, and he shared a coaching journey which he had with one of his customers. So it was a lady who was in a very senior position, and this was their first meeting. And that lady sort of shared her past history, background, everything. And while Aldo was listening, she sort of shared how her childhood was very troubled, how her education and everything was very challenged. They were not from well-off family. And then her marriage itself was very troubled and it resulted in a divorce, etc. But she had two children who were very lovely and she really loved them. And then at her workplace, she had lots of challenges dealing with how to rise up in the organization, etc. And all through her life, she kept sort of sharing all the challenges and all the difficulties and everything which she went through. And she was sort of in tears also at a number of places. And when she finished, Aldo sort of, he was operating at level 4 of listening. And while she was talking of all the challenges and all the difficulties and all the issues which she had, what he was seeing was all the victories which she had in her whole life. Right from young age to where she was today, she had a whole set of victories. She overcame obstacles and all the difficulties. So he trusted his instinct and posed a question to her, which was, do you celebrate your victories? And she was sort of at a loss. And she said, no, I am always preparing for the next battle or for the next difficulty or challenge. So he said, I am giving you a coaching assignment. I would like you to write a letter to yourself and to your children, sharing all the victories which you had. And I would like you to say you want to celebrate it with, she liked cakes. So to celebrate with some cake, which is the best cake you want. And she said, can I invite my parents and my nephews and others? And he said, sure, whoever you'd like to invite, but I'd like you to celebrate these victories which you had and recognize that you have, gone through all this, but recognize that you have victories and you need to celebrate. And she sent him a photograph after the event, which was 2 or 3 days later. And there was a huge acknowledgement from her, and the entire thing was of a lot of joy, a lot of fun, and a lot of smiling. And what he said was, he facilitated a change just by listening to her, from being somebody who was always like a warrior to somebody who was going to be like a lover, a magician, or somebody who was going to bring joy. And he said that, when I'm listening from level 4, that's the kind of shift which you can sort of bring into another person. And that's probably, it sort of struck a chord with me, and that's what I had shared with John and others, and he sort of asked me to share it with you.
Bhaskar, thank you for sharing that. What I'd like to do now is we have a whole bunch of participants on this webinar. And given what we have seen so far of Theory U and Otto Scharmer's 4 levels of listening, something that happens in our coaching conversation. And because there are 4 different levels, our endeavor at all times is to try and reach the highest level. So what I'm curious to hear is the experiences of the coaches in our group here attending this webinar, and what have been some of your personal experiences, and if there is some way that we can relate to what Otto Scharmer is talking about. So if you'd like, you can type in the chat box, and then depending upon we can pick some of them, and perhaps have you come up and share on that topic.
John, while they answer, just a couple of points.
Yes.
One is that I've invited Eva to join. Eva Pontes, she's an MCC coach, along with Fiona. They both would be later this year starting up a transpersonal coaching workshop for Kocharya. And Eva was also my supervisor when I was doing my supervisory session for the EMCC. The reason I called Eva on the panel is that earlier this evening, Fiona, Eva, and I were talking about transpersonal coaching, and she talked about the relevance of Otto Scharmer and Thierry Yu, and they have done a lot of work. And she also, which I'm sure she will share, that in addition to the standard book of Thierry Yu by Otto Scharmer, there is this book of Essentials of Thierry Yu or something of that sort, which she said is a much simpler book to read, according to him, Otto Scharmer himself. The second is what I also would like to invite all of you, go to the website at some point in time, and later today, if we have time, we will cover that as well, is we would really like all of you to see the MOOC program offered by edX on what is called the Lab Zero, Thierry Yu Lab Zero. It is just about 90 minutes, 6 or 7 videos, I'm not quite sure. I was tremendously impressed by it. And one of the things that inspired me to do was to probably put together a large group. And I would like many of you who are participants today, almost over 100 now, it's reading 108 at this point in time. At least even if half of you can join, go through this. The content is all archived. You can go through it at your leisure. And in June, they're going to start what is called the Thierry Yu Lab 1 program, which is an action learning program. And even that, the previous one is archived. You can go through that. It might take a little more time. And we really would like to put that together moving forward in terms of what Scharmer is talking about as an emerging future. I've been reading this book. Thierry Yu is not an easy book to read. It's a very, very, very dense book, very intensive. Every few pages, I have to sit down and reflect for half an hour. But it's been worth it. The kind of insights that have come up are tremendously valuable as individual, as part of a larger team, as well as in terms of our coaching itself. Eva, I would like to have your comments while we get feedback from the audience, and probably the panel can answer some of those questions.
And Eva, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. I wasn't counting on this, but thank you. What a wonderful panel, and thanks for all you've shared. And yeah, so the book, the simple version, according to Scharmer himself, is this one. I think he released it end of last year, Essentials of Thierry Yu. And he has revised his own way of explaining the theory into an easier way to absorb it. And so what I would like to add to you, and I've also been thinking about the use of Thierry Yu in coaching and supervision. And there is a quote, this quote is not by Scharmer himself. He quotes someone else, the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, and it says, the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So what do we as coaches need to bring not only in terms of the listening, where we're listening from, but how are we connected to our own source to enable our coachee to connect with his own source. So that's the kind of reflection I'd like to bring. And I have a story too. Just last night, I was coaching someone who is trying to create a new chapter for her professional life. And as she was talking, I saw the image of a tree growing in front of me. And I just shared it with her because it came from somewhere. It came from my source. I was just connected to her. And all I could see was a tree blooming. And I just shared it with her. And she decided to draw the tree. She said, this makes total sense. And she started drawing a tree. And what was beautiful about it is she chose to draw a baobab. I don't know if you have that in India. It's a tree with a very strong trunk. And I asked her, what does it mean? She said, I had never drawn this before. I'm just noticing how many resources I have and I wasn't aware of. And then the conversation developed. So what's your inner condition that can share? You're so connected when you are in that place that you can really help the client, the coachee, go there. I think I hope it helps.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for sharing that. So like we had mentioned, I'm curious to hear what have been some of the experiences of the other coaches here. One of the things that Otto Scharmer referred to in his video is that at the point of generative listening, he said there is a change in your own energy. You are able to sense a change in your own energy. And I'm reminded of a coaching I had recently where I was coaching somebody. And when that point happened, I felt a sense of excitement. And I was able to sense the future that was emerging for this person. And he was in that moment able to sense it for himself. And I could then detect a shift in his own energy as well. And then you know that the things are moving in a way that they will begin to happen. So if some of you have had some experiences or even struggles that you might have had in your listening process, then maybe now is a good time for us to share and learn from each other.
John, I just promoted Sneha Mandela to the panel. She had sort of given some information on Otto Scharmer's website and so on. So she seems to be familiar with what it is. Sneha, if you would like to unmute yourself, and in case you can talk about your insights.
Definitely, Ram. So I encountered this smoke in the last session, and you had just barely given the introduction about it. So I went ahead and explored it. It is pretty much self-paced and doesn't take up it doesn't take up the entire 90 minutes. There is material to review and interact with, and there are several videos of Otto speaking, and he does a very, very good job of explaining the diagram that you see up there and several variations of it in the course. So very insightful, and based on this was the course 0, and based on this, I think I'm going to purchase the book Theory U and dwell deeper. But he does do a pretty good job of covering the fundamentals. You cannot earn a certificate per se, but you can pay, I think, $49 to upgrade to get a certificate once you complete the course.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I were you, I wouldn't bother about the certificate. Just enjoy the course and learn what you can. That's more than enough. And then buy the books. I think there's some other people who have commented on it. If you see John, there was something on, I'm not quite sure, looking at the past viewing, I had put in something there. One of the things, I think paraphrasing what John said is, if any of you can share, when was it the last time that when you did your coaching, that you were able to have a generative view of the coach, of the client, I'm sorry. Otto Scharmer talks only about generative listening. I like to look at it as generative visioning. Are you able to envision the client in the space that the client wishes to be? And therefore, are you able to listen to the client, respond to the client, treat the client the way the client wishes to be? And what difference would it make? And secondly, instead of Otto Scharmer in some ways is really standing the grow model on its head. The grow model talks about the ground reality that needs to be looked at before you get the goal. What happens if you don't? What happens if you just look at the emerging future without worrying about the past? Would it seem any different? It may be difficult for you to answer that question. It's not an easy book to read, as someone had pointed out. But there's a chapter there where Otto Scharmer talks about his personal experience. When he was a school kid, one day he was called off from school saying something terrible had happened, and he comes home and he finds that his father's farmhouse has completely burned down. Everything his father had built, his grandfather had built, was all up there in ashes. And he said at that point in time, his grandfather made a comment which sort of allowed him to look at things differently. Not about what they had lost about in the past, what is it that they can do to bring about what was the past into the future, but can I, out of these embers, as it were, the ashes, look at my future in a very, very different way? And he says at that point in time, he had his first kind of epiphany of the emerging future. So this is something which I've been thinking about a lot since the time that I started reading about Otto Scharmer and Theory U for a while now. And it's an amazing differential view. Just to give one point, at some point in time, somewhere in the book, he talks about the concept of absencing versus presencing. Most of us engage in absencing, pretty much 90% of the world. And that's a slide which is there up there now. The absencing starts with denying that there is something wrong. Someone saying, oh, there is no such thing as a climate change effect. There is no such thing as an immigration refugee problem. There is no such thing as religious intolerance. There is no such thing as racial discrimination. And there are many people. 80% of the population probably consists of such people. And then there are another 15% of the people, or maybe more, who say, yeah, maybe there is, but I'm not responsible for it. I'm not part of it. I'm not supporting it. So it doesn't concern me. But eventually it will. And there are just probably 5% of the people or less who are able to say, yes, I'm part of the problem. I need to do something about it. I have to get together along with other people to be able to do that. So you move from the individual to the larger collective consciousness. And that is, in a way, is all Otto Scharmer is about. And then he talks about the theory U, which is a U-shaped curve, where you start looking at issues with an open mind, not denying, not saying I'm not part of it, but fully accepting that whatever is happening out there is part of me. I'm open. And there needs to be an emerging future that is very different. And in order to get to the emerging future, I need to connect. That is an open heart. I need to empathize. And then as a result of it, going deep inside, reflecting, searching, you will come to the point, if there is racial intolerance, if there is religious intolerance, I'm a part of it. And therefore, what is it that I can be to be part of the solution, to be part of the change? And that is the open will. And from there, you start co-creating and moving upwards. I think theory U for the first time that I have come across is a concept which coaches can use for societal transformation. Otherwise, it's all about, oh, I'm coaching leaders, I'm coaching executives. I'm tired of that. Everybody wants to be known for coaching CEOs and CXOs. The world is not completely about CEOs and CXOs. There are billions of people out there who need help and who can be helped and who can be leaders as well, just as big as any CXO and CEO. As coaches, do we have a responsibility? Would we like to take the responsibility? And I think that's one of the messages Otto Scharmer is sending across. It's not easy to read, but I think there's a serious message out there. So we would like to see some of your responses, views, and if some of you want to come up to the panel and talk about it. In the meantime, if any of you in the panel would like to sort of take up from where I left.
Yeah, Ram, so just to take it up from where you left, there is a very good question from Nitha here that how do you suspend your judgment, or how do you relate to, is it my judgment, or is it what generative listening is what I'm listening to? So look at this. I would like to connect it that way. That so if you look at the screen, it talks about seeing, sensing, and presencing. So it's not only we who are listening to the client, but initially, as Otto mentioned, that great coaches look at the client, look at the person with the future possibility. So initially, when the client comes to us, he or she is in the sense of absencing, where if you see that there is a closed will, there is a closed heart, there is a closed mind, and there is some clouding happen in the mind, and then the coaching conversation begins. So the moment you ask the question that what would you like to achieve at the end of the session, that itself is opening of the future possibility. And then from there you take it further, which is coaching competency 2, that how it is important for you and what would you need to resolve. And then you go to ask questions about values and beliefs. And I think in my coaching practice, some of the biggest breakthroughs that I have experienced happening with the client, when we have asked the questions around what is the bigger purpose you feel could be achieved, or what is the bigger purpose you are trying to achieve alongside the situation. And the client goes in that moment of presencing, where he's reflecting on the past, he's sensing the present, and then suddenly some aha moment comes and the insights emerge. So that's where we have, so as you rightly mentioned, it is difficult to practice, but the moment, John will talk more about it, but the moment what we've learned from Carl Rogers is about the unconditional positive regard for the client. So the moment I feel that the client has a future capability and he's competent enough to get there, and how do with my questioning, coaching presence and active listening, I take the client over there alongside. So John, would you like to expand this point?
Yeah, Ujjaval, just before that, John, I have a point to make. Ujjaval, can you stop sharing the screen unless we are going to use that?
Sure.
Now, Dita, the point that you are making is very valid, but you cannot go to generative listening if you are still in the first stage of listening to verify what you know or to justify what you know. And that is where judgment comes in. The first step is to moving away from that space where we are constantly listening selectively to things that we already know about the client or the client situations or the judgment we make of that client situation. The first step is moving away from that into what Scharmer calls the second one, which is about listening curiously, or whatever word he uses there, which is about looking from inside to outside. completely curious. I don't know. What is it that I can discover more about the client? That has to happen first. And then you move to the next step. I start looking at the client with empathy. I start relating to the client. That unconditional positive regard of Carl Rogers. Unconditional positive regard of Carl Rogers, you can interpret it in many ways, but I would interpret it still as a very high level of empathetic listening. The last level, once you've reached that, is then to be able to see the client, not where the client is, but where the client can be, where the client wishes to be. It may not be just what the client wishes to be, because sometimes the client may have a potential which is greater than what the client himself or herself can imagine. In which case, it's a hidden potential that is coming up for you. And you may be able to see it in what the Bhagavad Gita calls the Vishwarupa Darshana, to be able to see it from that perspective. So the generative listening is not something, you're absolutely right. It's maybe okay in theory, but if you want to see it in practice, you need to go through each of these steps from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. That's my own learning. John, yeah, sorry.
And also to add to what you said, Ram, when Carl Rogers talks about unconditional positive regard, my interpretation of that is also the fact that he holds a client in absolute unconditional positive regard, even in terms of the client's future. So he believes in the client. He knows the client has the potential. He knows the client has the answers that he is seeking to. And all I need to do is to be able to provide that space where listening happens at a level where not only can I sense it, but even the client can sense what is happening to him or herself. Yes, Eva? Go ahead, Eva.
Thank you. It's very interesting, the links that you're making to Rogers. And I'd like to enrich this vision going back to Scharmer, because he says that the three enemies of going down the left side of the U are the voices of judgment, the voices of cynicism, and the voices of fear. So the way I would look at it from our perspective here today is that we have to really listen from that space, from the levels 3 and 4. We should listen for the voices of judgment of the young client. Where is he judging himself? Where is his voice of cynicism? That's failing to be vulnerable. And where's his voice of fear, as well as ours? So we're constantly looking at ourselves again. Where are we? May we be judging or being cynical or being afraid to touch? So looking at these enemies, these three voices from these two perspectives, that might help.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Eva. Yes. I don't think I've seen any on the chat that allude to people's experiences of their own listening. Something that I'm very curious to hear. One of the things that Vijay Jayanti has alluded to is asking this question: how do we distinguish our sensing to be true? And she has written a follow-up comment saying that so that we don't make false promises or lead coachees along not so right path. Any of the panelists would like to take up that question?
Yeah, I noticed that question. I think it's a very powerful question. I think the difference, it's very difficult to make it binary. If you take the examples of a few people that many of us do recognize as great leaders, the promised land that they talked about was not just their promised land, but it was shared by a number of people. If you take Mahatma Gandhi, if you take Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, or Mother Teresa, unlike a corporate leader or a military strategist, they have these visions which are selfish to a large extent, self-aggrandizement. These people were willing to sacrifice themselves for a cause that was larger than them. I think that is probably one way in which you can distinguish. And many of them, they in fact espouse those causes not based on what was happening in the past and not to build on the past, but they did it through an emerging future. I'm not sure whether Mahatma Gandhi had a complete concept of the free India. But for him, that was the emerging future, when it was not even a gleam in the eye of most people. And so it was it for Martin Luther King. It was the era of Rosa Parks and so on in the United States, where the African Americans were treated worse than animals. And then he had this dream. And so it was with Nelson Mandela, who spent most of his life in an 8-foot cell, not knowing when freedom would come to him and to the land. So I guess there's a combination of things here. And if you really go through in depth in the theory U, I see the theory U as an inversion of the iceberg model of Jung and Freud, where the lower levels are full of the unconscious negativities, in a sense, at least in the Freudian model. And whereas in the theory U, he inverts it to show that the deeper you go, there is this amazingly powerful collective consciousness which tells you what is right and what is wrong in a much larger collective sense. So I guess the answer to yours, Vijay Jayanti, is multiple ways. One is, am I speaking from my unconscious incompetence, or am I speaking from my unconscious competence? Am I speaking from the negatives of my trauma of the past, or am I speaking from the collective consciousness of my future? It may still not sound right. It may not still come out right. I think it only happens when you are in a deep state of intuition. And that is a state that he calls as presencing, which I would very simply call meditation. If you go into that state, I think probably there will be a much greater awareness of where we are.
Ram, one of the things which, when I was listening to that webinar, what Aldo was alluding to was that, when you are at listening at level 4, then probably your gut is telling you that this is what you see, and you have to intuitively believe it and share it with your client. So probably one reaches there, I guess, through experience.